So we're going to be approaching this third topic of economics and free trade. First question here also goes to Mr. Perkins. And the question also comes from Ms. Leslie Klinger. Mr. Perkins, the American Solidarity Party promotes the economic concept of distributism. This is a concept that is distinct from both capitalism and socialism. However, the average American hears that term and thinks that their property is going to be taken from them and redistributed. How would you, as president, both educate the public and move us in that economic direction? Mr. Perkins, you have 2 minutes to respond, and your time begins now.
Well, I think one way is to use the bully pulpit in a constructive way, perhaps even using Twitter in a positive fashion, unlike what we see currently. Using it to link to explainers about different issues that the public might not be familiar with, to share quotes from essays and articles and books. And I think putting forward a plan, a comprehensive economic plan that has distributism at its heart would go a long way towards that as well. So that people understand that it's not socialism, it's not capitalism, it's a middle way in between where we have property distributed, but not distributed to the state, not where it's collectively held, it's individually held by each individual family, within each community, so that everyone has the means to provide for their own living. And so I think that to move in that direction, we need to fundamentally revise the laws. I think Joe made some good points earlier about how we should do that. I think that limiting the size of companies, as well as regulating the financial industry much more stringently so that they don't have as much power over the economy, and then encouraging co-ops and other distributive forms of ownership and organization would be a great start.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. Does anyone have a response to that or a rebuttal? All right, the floor recognizes Mr. Brian Carroll. Mr. Carroll, you have 1 minute to respond, and your time begins now.
I think most Americans are familiar with credit unions as opposed to banks. And that's an example of distributism that most Americans can relate to positively. I think those people who work with credit unions have discovered that they're more responsive than banks are. Banks seem to be capable of ignoring customers. That's been my experience, and credit unions don't. Beyond that, I think I would simply plagiarize our platform. What I saw today on distributism in the proposed platform is wonderful.
All right, thank you, Mr. Carroll. All right, so we'll be moving on to our next question now. This question goes to Mr. Joe Schriner. It's from an anonymous ASP member. Mr. Schriner, universal basic income and the idea of a citizen's dividend has recently entered the American political discourse. Are these economic policies which you would support implementing? Why or why not? Mr. Schriner, you have 2 minutes to respond. And your time begins now.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of UBI. And maybe in the short term for some workers where their jobs are being replaced by automation. But as I have mentioned earlier, I would be an extremely strong proponent of a paradigm shift in the country, where again, we went back to an agrarian-based society with small family farms. We went back to, as was just being talked about, a distributist society across the board when it came to economics, when it came to corporations and small mom and pop shops, as I've been talking about. I think that what there is, there's been an encyclical in my particular church called On Human Work, and it's all about the dignity of the worker. And so I'm a strong proponent of providing as many jobs as possible across the board that, again, is productive work, not just paper shuffling and not just standing on an assembly line. I don't think that has a lot to do with human dignity as well. And so we need to go back to quality craftsmanship in this country. Again, we need to go back to apprenticeships. We need to go back to this farming. We actually proposed that farming classes be taught, not just out in the rural areas, but also in the cities. There's a lot of people that have vocations to farm, but they just don't know it. And so we need to provide that kind of education. And so in the long run, I also think that we need to very quickly here go to job sharing in this country. We've done a lot of research about that over time. We spend so much time as hamsters on the wheel where maybe we need to cut back a little bit, share jobs, and spend more time with family, faith.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schriner. Do we have any, Mr. Carroll, the floor recognizes you, and you have 1 minute to respond. Your time begins now.
We already have some proposals that look like UBI, but are not labeled that way. For example, the carbon fee and dividend proposals that are in Congress now to reduce our dependence on carbon and petroleum fuels would return various proposals, but one of them would return, I think, about $4,000 per family member per year. We also have things that should be returned to people. For example, Nestle pumps water out of our national parks and forests and doesn't pay a dime for it. They sell us the water and the American people get nothing for it. That should be changed so that Nestle's paying into a fund that could be distributed to Americans equally.
All right, thank you, Mr. Carroll. So we'll be moving on to our final question in this segment now. This question also happens to go to you. To Mr. Carroll, this is from Ms. Jonna Baker. Mr. Carroll, approximately 260 million acres of U.S. forests have been cleared in order to create cropland to produce feed for animals raised for human consumption. Do you believe that this is a responsible use of land, and are there better alternatives which would further the common good? Mr. Carroll, you have 2 minutes to respond, and your time begins now.
I guess I would ask what the time frame is on 260 million acres. That sounds like it probably goes back quite a ways, and we can't reverse, at least not quickly, the forests that have been cleared. We want to obviously have as much forest as possible because that stores carbon. And I do think that we can move in the direction of get away from feedlots that feed grain and things to animals. Some of the forests are used for herd animals. And in fact, when they're restoring land that has been desertified, one of the things they do to help restore the land is bring in herd animals. So I think it's a complex question and needs to be dealt with on kind of a case-by-case basis.
All right, thank you, Mr. Carroll. Looks like we do have a response for you from Mr. Joe Schriner. Mr. Schriner, you have 1 minute to respond. Your time begins now.
Very good. Yeah, this is an extremely valid question. And I think, number one, we're nuts right now about the fires down in Brazil, in the Brazilian rainforest, but we clear cut the whole eastern half of the United States in order to do what Ms. Baker is talking about. And so we need to look at that, and we need to, number one, start replanting the trees. We went out to Nebraska City, Nebraska, town of 7,000, they're planting 10,000 trees over a period of 10 years in this town in order to start to reforest. Nebraska City, Nebraska happens to be the home of Arbor Day as well. But these projects are starting up all over. We also need to look at our feedlots, as Brian was talking about. This right now, the American public, we're spending so much time consuming meat and being pretty spoiled about it, as opposed to cutting back on meat consumption. Our administration would do a Eating is a Moral Act program. Actually, we'd probably have Jonna as the head of that. But we need to look at how much of the third world we could feed with some of the grain that we're feeding these animals.